There comes a moment when God interrupts your routine, not with noise, but with clarity. A holy discomfort settles in your spirit, and you realize you've been busy surviving when you were called to steward. Life isn't falling apart because you're incapable. It's unraveling because it's unmanaged. Disorder has a way of disguising itself as normal when you've lived with it long enough. But today is a wake-up call, not one wrapped in shame, but one rooted in responsibility. God is not asking you to become someone else. He is asking you to organize what He already placed in your hands. Because alignment precedes acceleration, and structure makes room for grace to flow where chaos once lived. Disorder delays destiny because confusion consumes energy that was meant for purpose. When your life lacks structure, every decision feels heavier than it should, every responsibility feels overwhelming, and every opportunity feels mistimed. It's not that God hasn't spoken. It's that the noise of disorganization keeps drowning out His instructions. Disorder doesn't always look like mess. Sometimes it looks like scattered priorities, inconsistent habits, and unmanaged emotions. You can love God deeply and still live disoriented. You can be anointed and still be undisciplined. Destiny requires movement, and movement requires direction. But disorder keeps you spinning in circles, mistaking motion for progress. Many people think delay comes from external opposition, but often it comes from internal chaos. You're praying for elevation while avoiding evaluation. God is ready to release more, but more cannot rest on what is unstable. When your time is unstructured, your finances unmanaged, your relationships undefined, and your mind overcrowded, destiny waits at the door while disorder sits on the couch acting comfortable. Disorder is subtle. It convinces you that you'll get to it later, that tomorrow will be better, that motivation will magically appear. But destiny responds to obedience, not intention. The enemy doesn't have to destroy you if he can distract you. Disorder becomes his favorite tool because it doesn't feel sinful, it just feels familiar. You delay your calling not because you said no to God, but because you never created space to say yes fully. Every assignment requires capacity, and capacity is built through order. When your life is cluttered, you spend more time managing emergencies than building legacy. Destiny is not rushed, but it is intentional, and disorder removes intention from your days. God is a God of order, not because He is rigid, but because order protects what matters. Creation itself followed a sequence. Light before land, boundaries between waters, purpose assigned before function expressed. If God values order in creation, why would destiny thrive in your life without it? Disorder makes you late to rooms you prayed to enter. It makes you forget instructions you asked for. It makes you exhausted before the real work even begins. You call it burnout, but often it's just mismanagement. When you refuse to organize your life, you force your future to wait on a version of you that hasn't made room for growth yet. Destiny requires alignment between who you are becoming and how you are living. You can't ask God to expand your influence when your foundation is fragile. Disorder cracks foundations quietly. It shows up as missed deadlines, broken commitments, half-finished goals, and emotional reactions that sabotage divine connections. Destiny isn't delayed because God changed His mind. It's delayed because structure hasn't caught up with prayer. There is a difference between being patient and being postponed. Disorder postpones what discipline could accelerate. The life you want requires systems, not just faith confessions. Faith initiates, but order sustains. When you organize your life, you are telling God that you value what He's entrusting to you. You're saying you're ready to handle the weight of answered prayers. Disorder communicates unreadiness even when your heart is willing. You cannot carry tomorrow's responsibility with yesterday's habits. Destiny demands growth, and growth demands change. Organizing your life isn't about control, it's about clarity. It allows you to see what deserves your yes and what needs your no. It helps you recognize distractions before they become detours. When disorder leaves, focus enters. When focus enters, consistency follows. Destiny no longer has to wait for you to catch up. Every season of delay invites you to check your order, not to condemn yourself, but to correct alignment. God's grace covers you, but His wisdom leads you. Disorder keeps you reacting. Order positions you to respond. Destiny responds to readiness. When you choose structure, you are choosing stewardship over survival, intention over impulse, purpose over pressure, and alignment over chaos, making space for the next instruction to land clearly, deeply. And without resistance, discipline is a form of self-respect because it reflects how much you value the life God trusted you with. It is the quiet decision to honor your future more than your feelings, to choose consistency over convenience, and to show up for yourself even when no one is watching. Discipline is not punishment, it is protection. It protects your time, your energy, your peace, and your purpose. When you lack discipline, you unintentionally communicate that your calling is optional and your growth negotiable. But when you practice discipline, you declare that your life matters too much to be left to chance. Self-respect begins when you stop abandoning yourself. Every time you say you'll start and don't, every time you ignore what you know you need, every time you allow excuses to override commitment, a small fracture forms in how you trust yourself. Discipline repairs that trust. It rebuilds integrity between who you say you are and how you live. You cannot expect confidence to grow in a life where promises to yourself are constantly broken. Discipline teaches you how to keep your word, especially when the word is spoken inwardly. Many people confuse discipline with restriction, but discipline is actually alignment. It aligns your habits with your values and your actions with your prayers. You say you want peace, but your schedule is chaotic. You say you want growth, but your habits are inconsistent. You say you want healing, but you keep revisiting environments that reopen wounds. Discipline steps in and says your desire deserves structure. It says your dreams deserve routine. It says your future deserves preparation. That is self-respect in motion. When you respect yourself, you stop overexposing yourself to what drains you. You learn when to rest and when to push. You learn how to say no without guilt and yes without resentment. Discipline helps you draw boundaries, not because you are cold, but because you are committed to becoming whole. It teaches you that not everything you can do deserves your energy. Self-respect doesn't require applause, it requires courage. The courage to be consistent when results are slow, and the courage to be disciplined when motivation fades. Discipline is choosing what you want most over what you want now. It's waking up and doing the work even when no one affirms you for it. It's staying organized so your mind can breathe. It's managing your emotions so they don't manage you. It's caring for your body because it carries your assignment. Discipline says, I am worth the effort it takes to grow. It says, I refuse to sabotage my future for temporary comfort. You don't rise to the level of your intentions. You live at the level of your discipline. Without discipline, talent becomes frustrating and potential becomes exhausting. You start resenting gifts you prayed for because you didn't prepare for the responsibility attached to them. Discipline teaches you how to hold what you asked for. It stretches your capacity without breaking your character. It keeps you grounded when opportunities come quickly and anchored when progress feels slow. Self-respect shows up in the small decisions. How you manage your mornings, how you speak to yourself when you make mistakes, how you respond instead of react. Discipline is choosing order over chaos even when chaos feels familiar. For some people, disorder feels safe because it's known. Discipline requires you to step into unfamiliar consistency. It asks you to believe that your life is worthy of care, planning, and intentional effort. God honors discipline because it demonstrates stewardship. Grace is free, but growth is intentional. Discipline doesn't earn God's love, but it positions you to experience the fullness of what He's offering. When you discipline your time, you hear God more clearly. When you discipline your habits, you walk with more confidence. When you discipline your thoughts, you live with more peace. Discipline doesn't make life perfect, but it makes life purposeful. Every act of discipline is a declaration that you are no longer living on autopilot. You are choosing awareness over avoidance, responsibility over excuses, maturity over impulse. Discipline teaches you how to sit with discomfort without quitting. It builds emotional strength that sustains you when feelings fluctuate. Self-respect grows when you realize that your consistency is an act of love toward yourself and obedience toward God. You don't need more motivation. You need more respect for the assignment on your life. Discipline is how that respect is expressed daily. It is the evidence that you believe your life has meaning beyond survival. When you honor your time, your boundaries, your body, and your calling, you create a life that can support the weight of purpose, the demands of destiny, and the growth that comes with becoming who God designed you to be. What you don't organize will control you because unmanaged areas of your life never stay neutral. They don't wait patiently for your attention. They quietly take authority. Disorganization doesn't just create inconvenience. It creates influence. Whatever lacks structure begins to dictate your mood, your decisions, and your reactions. When your time isn't organized, everything feels urgent. When your finances aren't organized, anxiety makes choices for you. When your emotions aren't organized, Old wounds start speaking louder than present truth. Control shifts when responsibility is avoided. Many people believe freedom comes from flexibility, but true freedom comes from order. When you don't decide how your life will flow, life decides for you. Unorganized schedules turn into constant busyness. Unorganized thoughts turn into mental fatigue. Unorganized priorities turn into misplaced effort. You start responding instead of leading, reacting instead of discerning, surviving instead of stewarding. What you fail to manage will manage you, and it rarely does so gently. Disorganization is deceptive because it feels temporary. You tell yourself you'll fix it later, but later becomes a lifestyle. Meanwhile, the unorganized area keeps demanding attention, pulling focus from what actually matters. It controls your energy, not because it's important, but because it's loud. Chaos is always loud. Purpose is often quiet. Without organization, noise wins. Your calling gets crowded out by clutter you never confronted. When your life isn't organized, you begin to confuse pressure with purpose. Everything feels heavy, so you assume everything matters. But organization teaches discernment. It shows you what deserves your yes and what requires your no. Without it, you say yes out of guilt, fear, or habit. You overcommit, overextend, and overwhelm yourself, then wonder why peace feels unreachable. The truth is, peace isn't missing. It's buried under what you never put in order. Unorganized emotions are especially controlling. When feelings aren't processed, they leak into every conversation, every decision, every relationship. You think you're responding to the moment, but you're actually reacting from unresolved history. Organization creates emotional awareness. It allows you to name what you feel instead of being driven by it. Without that clarity, emotions take the wheel and wisdom sits in the passenger seat. What you don't organize will eventually cost you more than time. It costs clarity, it costs confidence, it costs opportunities. You miss moments not because you weren't invited, but because you weren't ready. Disorganization keeps you in a constant state of catch up. You're always behind, always tired, always apologizing, always promising to do better next time. Control slips away slowly, then all at once. God gives instruction, but organization gives execution. You can hear God clearly and still live chaotically. Revelation without structure creates frustration. Vision without systems creates burnout. Prayer without planning creates stagnation. Organization is how you translate what God said into how you live. Without it, even divine ideas become overwhelming. The gift starts to feel like a burden because it's resting on a life that lacks support. When you refuse to organize your life, you unintentionally empower distractions. Every notification feels urgent. Every request feels necessary. Every crisis feels personal. Organization creates filters. It helps you recognize what aligns with your assignment and what simply demands attention. Without filters, everything feels equal. And when everything feels equal, nothing gets the excellence it deserves. Control often shows up as stress before it shows up as failure. Your body feels it, your mind feels it, your spirit feels it. That constant edge, that low-level anxiety, that sense of always being behind is often a signal that something needs structure. Not more effort, not more motivation, but more order. Organization doesn't remove responsibility, it puts it in its proper place. When you organize your life, you reclaim authority. You stop letting circumstances dictate your emotions. You stop letting habits dictate your future. You stop letting disorder speak louder than direction. Organization is an act of leadership over your own life. It says, I decide what has access to me. It says, I choose what grows and what gets cut off. It says, I will not be ruled by what I refuse to manage. What you organize begins to serve you instead of stress you. Your time starts working with you instead of against you. Your mind gains margin to think clearly. Your spirit gains space to hear God. Control shifts back into your hands, not through force. Organization doesn't make life perfect, but it makes life responsive to wisdom rather than reactive to chaos, allowing you to live from purpose instead of pressure and from clarity instead of confusion. Clarity begins with boundaries because without limits, everything blends together and nothing stands out with purpose. When boundaries are absent, confusion feels normal and exhaustion feels unavoidable. You wonder why your mind feels crowded, why your emotions feel stretched, and why your progress feels slow. But the root issue is often a lack of separation. Boundaries create definition. They draw lines that help you understand where you end and where others begin, where your responsibility stops, and where trust in God must start. Without boundaries, clarity has nowhere to live. Many people avoid boundaries because they fear conflict or rejection. They think saying no will make them seem selfish, unloving, or unavailable. But boundaries are not walls, they are doors with locks. They allow you to decide what enters your life and what stays out. When you don't establish boundaries, you give everyone and everything unlimited access, and unlimited access always leads to misuse. Your time gets overbooked, your energy gets drained, and your purpose gets diluted. Clarity disappears when everything is allowed to demand something from you. Boundaries protect your focus. When you don't define what matters most, distractions define it for you. Every request feels urgent. Every problem feels personal. Every interruption feels unavoidable. Boundaries help you prioritize without guilt. They give you permission to protect what God is developing in you. Clarity grows when your yes becomes intentional and your no becomes confident. You stop explaining yourself to people who benefit from your lack of limits. You stop apologizing for honoring your capacity. Emotional boundaries are especially necessary for clarity. When you absorb everyone else's feelings, expectations, and reactions, you lose touch with your own. You start making decisions to keep peace instead of following conviction. You confuse empathy with responsibility. Boundaries allow you to care without caring. They help you support without sacrificing your stability. Without emotional boundaries, your clarity is constantly compromised by moods that aren't yours and pressures you were never meant to hold. Spiritual clarity also depends on boundaries. You cannot hear God clearly when your spirit is overcrowded. Constant noise, constant access, constant stimulation dulls discernment. Boundaries create quiet. They carve out space for reflection, prayer, and rest. When everything has access to you, God's voice competes with urgency instead of leading it. Boundaries signal reverence. They say this time is sacred, this space is protected, this focus is non-negotiable. Clarity thrives in environments where God is prioritized, not squeezed in. Boundaries expose what truly matters. When you start setting limits, resistance often reveals misplaced expectations. People who benefited from your overextension may struggle with your growth. That discomfort is not a sign you're wrong. It's often a sign you're changing. Clarity requires courage, the courage to disappoint others in order to obey God, the courage to choose long-term alignment over short-term approval. Boundaries help you see which relationships are mutual and which ones are dependent on your depletion. Without boundaries, your identity becomes blurred. You start defining yourself by what you do for others instead of who God called you to be. Your worth becomes tied to productivity and availability. Boundaries restore identity. They remind you that you are valuable even when you rest, even when you say no, even when you choose yourself. Clarity comes when you stop performing and start discerning. When you stop reacting and start responding. When you stop living on demand and start living on purpose. Boundaries also bring clarity to your goals. When everything is a priority, nothing gets your best. Boundaries force you to choose. They help you eliminate what no longer aligns with the season you're in. Not every opportunity is an assignment. Not every open door is yours to walk through. Boundaries help you recognize the difference. They keep you from confusing business with obedience. Clarity grows when your actions align with your calling, not just your capability. God himself operates with boundaries. He rested. He withdrew. He said no. Jesus didn't heal everyone, didn't answer every question, didn't stay in every place. He honored his assignment by honoring his limits. If boundaries were necessary for him, they are not optional for you. Boundaries are not a lack of faith. They are an expression of wisdom. They show trust in God's ability to work even when you step back. Clarity begins when you stop leaking energy into places that don't produce growth, when you stop revisiting conversations that steal peace, when you stop allowing access to people who disrespect your process. Boundaries simplify life. They reduce noise. They sharpen vision. They help you move from confusion to confidence, from overwhelm to order, from survival to intention. When you establish boundaries, your life starts making sense. Your decisions feel lighter because they are filtered through values instead of emotions. Your days feel purposeful because they are structured around what matters most. Boundaries don't limit your life, they define it. They give clarity room to breathe, direction room to lead, and purpose room to unfold without constant interruption, pressure, or distraction from what you were never meant to carry. Stewardship attracts stability because what you honor becomes supported. When you take responsibility for what God has already given you, you create an environment where growth can safely occur. Stability doesn't come from luck or timing, it comes from care. Many people pray for more while neglecting what is already in their hands. But stewardship is God's language for readiness. It says you value the assignment enough to manage it well. Stability follows stewardship because order invites trust, and trust invites increase. Stewardship is not about perfection, it's about attention. It's choosing to be present with your resources instead of passive. When you steward your time, your days stop bleeding into each other. When you steward your finances, stress loses its grip on your decisions. When you steward your relationships, they stop feeling fragile and start feeling grounded. Stability grows where things are handled with intention instead of avoidance. What you consistently care for begins to sustain you instead of strain you. Many people mistake stability for sameness, but true stability allows for movement without collapse. It's the difference between being busy and being built. Stewardship builds systems that can handle pressure. Without stewardship, every unexpected challenge feels like a crisis. With stewardship, challenges become adjustments instead of breakdowns. You stop panicking every time something shifts because your foundation isn't dependent on feelings or circumstances. Stability becomes the result of preparation, not control. God entrusts more to those who manage well, not because he is testing worth, but because he honors wisdom. Stewardship shows maturity. It reflects the ability to hold responsibility without resentment. When you complain about what you have, instability grows. When you care for what you have, peace settles in. Stewardship changes your posture from entitlement to gratitude, from impatience to faithfulness. Stability is attracted to hearts that respect process. Emotional stewardship is especially important. When you learn to manage your reactions, your life becomes calmer even when circumstances are demanding. You stop letting moods dictate movement. You learn how to pause, process, and respond with wisdom. Emotional stewardship doesn't suppress feelings, it organizes them. It allows you to feel without being ruled. Stability grows when your inner world is no longer chaotic. When your emotions are stewarded, your relationships feel safer and your decisions feel clearer. Spiritual stewardship attracts stability in your faith walk. When you consistently make space for God, your faith stops being reactive and starts being rooted. You're no longer chasing emotional highs, you're building spiritual depth. Stewardship looks like prayer even when life is quiet. It looks like obedience even when no one affirms it. Stability grows when your connection to God isn't dependent on crisis. Faith becomes an anchor instead of an emergency response. Stewardship also reveals where instability comes from. When something keeps breaking down, it often points to neglect, not attack. Stewardship invites you to examine patterns instead of blaming pressure. It teaches you to ask what needs structure, not what needs escape. Many people keep moving from place to place, relationship to relationship, job to job, thinking change will bring stability. But stability doesn't come from new environments, it comes from new management. When you steward your gifts, they stop overwhelming you. Talent without stewardship feels heavy. Opportunity without stewardship feels stressful. Calling without stewardship feels confusing. Stewardship creates containers that can hold growth. It allows your life to expand without falling apart. Stability is not the absence of challenge. It's the presence of systems that support you through challenge. God values stewardship because it mirrors his nature. He is faithful. He is consistent. He is intentional. When you steward well, you reflect his character. Stability follows because heaven responds to alignment. You begin to notice that things stop slipping through the cracks. Your mind feels clearer. Your schedule feels manageable. Your spirit feels settled. Not because life became easier, but because your handling of life became wiser. Stewardship teaches patience. It reminds you that growth is gradual and stability is built, not granted. You stop rushing seasons and start respecting them. You stop despising small beginnings and start cultivating them. Stability is attracted to people who understand that longevity requires care. What burns fast often burns out. What is stewarded well endures. When you commit to stewardship, you stop living in constant repair mode. You start living in maintenance mode. You're no longer waiting for things to fall apart before you act. You become proactive instead of reactive. Stability grows when problems are addressed early and habits are adjusted intentionally. Stewardship keeps small issues from becoming major disruptions. Your life begins to feel less fragile when you steward it well. You stop feeling like one mistake will ruin everything. You stop living on edge. Stability settles in because you know your foundation is supported by consistent care. Stewardship doesn't guarantee comfort, but does create security. It anchors you in responsibility rather than fear. It allows peace to grow quietly and confidently in a life that is handled with wisdom, faithfulness, and respect for what God has already placed within your reach. Emotional clutter affects spiritual growth because what overwhelms your soul eventually dulls your sensitivity to God. When emotions are unprocessed, they don't disappear, they accumulate. They pile up in your thoughts, your reactions, your prayers, and your expectations. You begin approaching God through layers of frustration, disappointment, fear, and fatigue instead of faith and trust. Spiritual growth requires space, and emotional clutter crowds that space until intimacy feels distant and clarity feels rare. Many people are faithful but emotionally overloaded. They show up, serve, pray, and believe, yet feel disconnected and drained. It's not because God moved away. It's because unresolved emotions have filled the room where communion once lived. Emotional clutter creates noise, and where there is noise, it becomes harder to discern God's voice. You start confusing God's silence with absence, when in reality, He is waiting for you to clear what has been blocking your awareness. Unhealed emotions often shape how you interpret God. Past disappointment can make you hesitant to trust Him fully. Rejection can make you question His intentions. Fear can make obedience feel unsafe. When emotional clutter is left unattended, it projects itself onto your theology. You begin believing God is distant, harsh, or unpredictable, when what you're really experiencing is emotional fatigue. Spiritual growth slows when emotions lead and truth follows behind. Emotional clutter also affects prayer. Instead of honest conversation, prayer becomes performance or avoidance. You either say what sounds spiritual instead of what's real, or you stop praying altogether because it feels exhausting. When emotions are disorganized, prayer feels heavy instead of healing. You come to God guarded, rehearsed, or numb. Spiritual growth thrives on authenticity, but emotional clutter trains you to suppress instead of surrender. Many people confuse emotional strength with emotional silence. They believe ignoring pain is maturity, but ignored pain doesn't disappear, it hardens. Emotional clutter builds walls where wisdom should be. It makes you spiritually rigid instead of responsive. You resist correction because it touches wounds you never addressed. You avoid conviction because it feels like shame. Spiritual growth requires humility, and humility requires emotional honesty. Relationships are another place where emotional clutter interferes with spiritual development. When emotions are unmanaged, you project expectations onto others that only God can fulfill. Disappointment multiplies. Offense settles in. Resentment grows quietly. These emotional weights affect how you love, forgive, and trust. Scripture becomes harder to live out because your heart is tired. Emotional clutter turns spiritual disciplines into obligations instead of lifelines. God often invites healing before He releases deeper revelation, not because He is withholding, but because He is protecting you. New levels of insight require capacity. Emotional clutter reduces capacity. It takes energy to carry unresolved feelings, leaving little strength to pursue growth. When you're emotionally overloaded, even small spiritual challenges feel overwhelming. You start avoiding growth opportunities, not because you lack desire, but because you lack emotional margin. Emotional clutter can also create spiritual inconsistency. Some days you feel close to God, other days distant. Not because He changed, but because your emotional state did. When emotions aren't stewarded, they become the measure of your faith. You believe God is good when you feel good and distant, when you feel overwhelmed. Spiritual growth stabilizes when truth, not emotion, becomes the foundation. That stability requires emotional organization. Processing emotions is not a lack of faith. It is an act of stewardship. God cares about your inner world. He invites you to bring your whole self, not just your spiritual language. When you name your pain, your fears, your disappointments, you make room for God to meet you there. Emotional clarity creates spiritual sensitivity. When the clutter clears, conviction becomes clearer, guidance becomes sharper, and peace becomes more accessible. Jesus often withdrew to quiet places, not to escape people, but to tend to His soul. He honored emotional rhythms. He wept, He rested, He grieved. Emotional health was not separate from His spiritual strength. When you ignore your emotions, you fragment yourself. When you steward them, you align your soul with your spirit. Emotional clutter keeps you living in reaction mode. You respond from old hurts instead of present wisdom. Spiritual growth requires intentional response. It requires you to pause, reflect, and choose obedience even when feelings resist it. That becomes nearly impossible when emotions are tangled and unresolved. As emotional clutter is addressed, spiritual growth accelerates naturally. You pray with honesty. You worship with freedom. You read Scripture with openness instead of defensiveness. God's voice feels closer, not louder, but clearer. Peace settles in places where tension once lived. Growth becomes less about striving and more about surrender. When your emotional space is cleared, your spirit has room to stretch, deepen, and mature without being weighed down by what was never meant to be carried this long. Small systems create lasting change because transformation is rarely the result of one dramatic decision. It is the outcome of repeated, intentional choices. Many people wait for motivation to overhaul their lives, but real change happens quietly, consistently, and often invisibly at first. Small systems shape daily behavior, and daily behavior shapes destiny. What you do routinely will always have more impact than what you do occasionally, no matter how powerful the moment felt. A system is simply a structure that supports consistency. It removes the pressure of relying on willpower alone. When you don't have systems, every decision requires emotional energy. You wake up negotiating with yourself about things that should already be decided. Small systems eliminate that negotiation. They tell your life how to function even when motivation is low. Lasting change depends less on how inspired you feel and more on how supported your habits are. People often underestimate small changes because they don't produce immediate results. But small systems work beneath the surface before they show up publicly. Just like roots grow underground before a tree appears above ground, systems build capacity before outcomes become visible. When you commit to small, repeatable actions, you are building a foundation that can hold growth without collapsing. Lasting change requires sustainability, and sustainability is created through structure. Small systems also reduce overwhelm. When change feels too big, the mind resists. But when change is broken into manageable steps, resistance decreases. Instead of trying to fix everything at once, systems focus on progress, not perfection. You stop quitting because you stop exhausting yourself. Small systems honor your humanity. They acknowledge that growth happens best in rhythms, not rush. Consistency reshapes identity. When you show up for small systems daily, you begin to see yourself differently. You stop identifying as someone who tries and start identifying as someone who follows through. Confidence grows not from big wins, but from repeated evidence that you can be trusted with responsibility. Small systems rebuild self-trust. They restore integrity between intention and action. Spiritual growth thrives on small systems. Prayer that is brief but consistent shapes faith more deeply than long prayers that happen only in crisis. Time in Scripture, even in small portions, renews the mind more effectively than sporadic intensity. Small spiritual systems create intimacy with God that feels natural instead of forced. Faith becomes woven into daily life instead of reserved for emergencies. Small systems also protect you during hard seasons. When life becomes unpredictable, systems provide stability. You may not control circumstances, but you can control your routines. These routines become anchors when emotions fluctuate. They keep you grounded when motivation fades. Lasting change depends on what remains intact when life applies pressure. Many people quit because they aim for outcomes instead of systems. Outcomes are inspiring, but systems are sustaining. You can't control results, but you can control process. When your focus shifts to systems, disappointment loses its power. You measure success by faithfulness, not speed. That shift keeps you moving even when progress feels slow. Small systems compound over time. What feels insignificant today becomes influential tomorrow. 5 minutes of focus daily becomes clarity. One healthy boundary practice consistently becomes peace. One organized habit repeated becomes stability. Change accelerates quietly until one day you look back and realize your life is no longer the same. Systems also make obedience practical. God often gives direction without detailing every step. Small systems help you walk out big instructions. They turn calling into daily practice. Without systems, vision stays abstract. With systems, vision becomes lived experience. Small acts of obedience repeated over time create a life aligned with purpose. Lasting change requires patience. Small systems teach you to trust the process instead of chasing immediacy. They train you to value growth over applause. You stop needing constant affirmation because your systems are working even when no one sees them. That quiet faithfulness produces strength that doesn't crumble under pressure. When you commit to small systems, you stop waiting for life to change and start participating in the change. You move from wishing to building, from hoping to stewarding, from inconsistency to rhythm. Small systems don't demand everything from you at once. They ask for you daily. And over time, that daily commitment reshapes your habits, your mindset, and your direction. Lasting change becomes inevitable, not because you forced it, but because you structured your life to support it every single day. Obedience often looks like preparation, because God rarely moves without first building capacity. Many people expect obedience to feel dramatic, public, or immediately rewarding, but more often it looks quiet, practical, and unseen. It looks like organizing your life when no one is applauding. It looks like developing discipline before opportunity arrives. It looks like getting ready for doors you prayed would open while trusting God with the timing. Preparation is obedience in seed form. God prepares before he promotes. He shapes before he showcases. When you obey by preparing, you are agreeing with God's process even when the promise feels delayed. Preparation requires faith because you are acting on what God said before you see evidence of it. You clean, build, plan, and structure not because it's convenient, but because you trust that what God spoke will require a ready vessel. Obedience that prepares says, I believe you enough to get ready. Preparation stretches patience. It asks you to work without immediate reward and to grow without instant recognition. Many people want confirmation before commitment, but obedience commits before confirmation appears. Preparation doesn't feel powerful because it happens in private. It's invisible to people but visible to God. And what God sees in secret, he honors in his timing. Preparation is not delay, it is development. When God told Noah to build the ark, obedience looked like construction long before rain was visible. When David was anointed king, obedience looked like tending sheep instead of sitting on a throne. When Joseph had dreams of leadership, obedience looked like integrity in obscurity. Preparation always precedes manifestation. God uses ordinary routines to prepare you for extraordinary responsibility. Preparation reveals trust. You don't prepare for something you don't believe is coming. When you obey through preparation, you are declaring faith with your actions. You align your habits with your hope. You structure your days around the future you believe God is leading you toward. Preparation bridges the gap between prayer and fulfillment. It keeps you active while waiting. Obedience through preparation often confronts pride. It humbles you. It reminds you that you don't get to skip process just because you are gifted. Talent opens doors, but preparation keeps you in the room. Without preparation, opportunities become overwhelming instead of empowering. God prepares you not to restrict you, but to protect you. He knows the weight of what you're asking for, and preparation strengthens your ability to carry it. Many people misinterpret waiting as inactivity, but biblical waiting is full of work. It's not passive, it's intentional. You wait by building. You wait by learning. You wait by refining your character. Obedience means you don't waste seasons that feel slow. You use them. Preparation turns waiting rooms into training grounds. Preparation also aligns your character with your calling. God is more concerned with who you are becoming than how fast you arrive. Obedience shapes your inner life before it elevates your outer life. It teaches you faithfulness in small things so you don't mishandle big things. Preparation helps you practice stewardship before responsibility increases. When obedience looks like preparation, it often feels lonely. There's little validation. Few people understand why you're doing what you're doing. But obedience isn't about being understood, it's about being aligned. God sees the consistency others overlook. He sees the discipline that feels unrewarded. He sees the preparation that feels premature. Preparation refines discernment. As you organize, plan, and grow, your sensitivity to God increases. You begin to recognize his timing more clearly. You stop forcing doors because you're confident in readiness. Obedience teaches you how to move with God instead of ahead of him. Preparation keeps you from arriving early and unready. Obedience often looks ordinary because it's woven into daily life. It's choosing responsibility over comfort. It's choosing growth over shortcuts. It's choosing faithfulness when excitement fades. Preparation doesn't feel spiritual, but it is deeply sacred. It is how you honor what God has spoken without rushing him to perform it. When the moment finally comes, preparation is what allows you to step in with confidence instead of fear. You don't scramble. You stand. You don't panic. You respond. Obedience that prepared you sustains you. The work you did in private supports you in public. The discipline you practice quietly holds you steady when pressure rises. Preparation doesn't make the promise happen, but it makes you ready when it does. Obedience trusts that God's timing is perfect and his process intentional. It continues building even when progress seems invisible. It chooses faith over frustration and responsibility over restlessness, shaping a life that is positioned, strengthened, and aligned for whatever God releases next.